Everybody, thanks for coming to this seminar. Today we have Alexander Plekhanov talking to us about connector economies in a fragmenting world. A very timely discussion. Thanks for joining us, and over to you. We have about 1 hour, and we usually just do it econ style with interruptions and questions.
That would be great.
Okay, thank you.
Great pleasure to be here, and it's a particular pleasure to present it in a region slightly different from the one we work on. I work for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, and we do global papers occasionally, and it's a real pleasure to present it in KL as well. And it's a very early work. On the way here, Hong Kong was the first presentation of it. It's gone quite a bit out of operational requests and analysis, and then we tried to put it into a little bit of analytical framework. In very broad terms, what we tried to do is to follow up a little bit on things that became quite well documented last year, that with increased geopolitical fragmentation, and that has been continuing and amplifying since the paper was written. The investment landscape has been fragmenting. There has been a lot less investment across geopolitically rival blocs and more investment within blocs. But what is probably different from the earlier episodes is a large role that has been played by connector economies, or some call them non-aligned economies, with a little bit more of Cold War flavor to it. And the original paper, one of the original papers by Peter Gopinath, others is called The New Cold War, and it's now coming out in Journal of International Economics. And basically that has established that, more or less. And so what we tried to do is to look at who exactly were those connector economies over the last couple of years who benefited from this change in landscape for indirect investment modes. And it has actually turned out that it's a fairly eclectic mix of various permutations and possibilities. It's not really sort of the sum of various characteristics that economies have that matters, but rather whether they are really attractive from some angle. And the main angle really is the market access, and access to a large market like the US or EU. But there are other angles as well. I will probably just start with some charts and results, and then we'll come back to the conclusions. So in very broad terms, it was basically an attempt to start digesting this wave of deglobalization and fragmentation in which we have entered. And certainly people take integration for granted a lot in the current debates. But if you look at economic history, the latest wave probably has started in earnest somewhere in the mid of 1980s, whether you count it from opening of China or end of Cold War, or the Uruguay round of WTO negotiations, or the start of EU enlargement. So people have different landmarks, but they all fall more or less into the same point in time. And if you look at various other waves before and after, it's kind of a common length of it. So it's not a very optimistic conclusion, and there are certainly people who think that the wave we're entering is also for 30, 40 years or so. Maybe there are more optimistic views of that. Well, optimistic depends who you ask. But if you work for the World Bank or European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, you're glad. But bread and butter is kind of integration. It's much harder to make a living in international development organizations out of the opposite. But and so what we're trying to do here is to look specifically at how greenfield, mostly investment flows, respond to fragmentation. What do these connector non-aligned economies, what role do they play? Which economies benefit and under which circumstances, and how this is then linked to industrial policies in geopolitically rival economies, mainly US and China, EU, but also connector economies themselves. There has been quite a bit of literature on these various types, including on industrial policy, and our latest annual economic report that I edited, a bit like the World Development Report, was on industrial policy, and so that was partly a spin-off from that one. So what we're trying to crunch in this paper is the database of foreign direct investment project announcements compiled by FDI markets. It covers the period from January 2003 until latest, but the latest, so we stopped in March 2024 here because the latest quarters, although available, they are subject to quite a few updates. So we will crunch the latest here a bit later. It's about 300,000 announcements. There is basic data on source country, destination country, sector information, fairly detailed, activity, R&D versus manufacturing versus logistics, etc. The interesting other variables that we play around with is whether it went into a special economic zone or not in the destination country, the region in the destination country, which actually didn't produce a lot of very interesting results. The announcement is actually quite valuable because that way these FDI projects, they respond quite promptly to various things that are happening in terms of geopolitical fragmentation. The actual FDI flows that hit balance of payments later is a slightly different variable, but also there can be quite a bit of a delay. The China and Malaysia may and Singapore may agree and unagree and agree and unagree the railroad to Singapore or something like that many times. But actually, if it ever gets started to be built, that's probably when some actual flows will get recorded in terms of shareholder loans or something like that that will go to FDI. So this is really done on announcements. There are estimates of capital expenditure and jobs created. We work with that as well a bit. The core of the analysis is done on project count, a bit like other papers, and it just has a slightly better statistical properties because capital expenditure and jobs fluctuate really wildly. It's also much harder to do Poisson pseudo-maximum likelihood on those variables sensibly, and people like that being done. And so the primary work is with counts. Yes.
Can I ask one question?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, and this is coming from a micro econ. So, in a way, the decision to become a connector economy is endogenous, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have this long period of data. Are you able to say something about what influences countries' decision to go one way or the other, like become a connector economy or align geopolitically with a bloc?
So that is a very interesting question, and indeed people prompt here a lot on what is basically, how do we construct these blocks and what is aligned and what is non-aligned. And you can do it indeed in very different ways. So basically the starting point of this paper that probably got, if anything, a bit corroborated by what happened in the last couple of months is just to start with the proposition that you have US and China, and then you could draw blocks around them to make it a bit easier for the statistical analysis. But you can also look at the raw data of what just happened with US investment and China investment, and just assume that these are the main rivals in the current concept. And this is not really empirically derived. It's a little bit of just sort of a starting point that there are two very large economies in the world that have a difficult relationship with globalization in particular. And so this is the investment from China to various places, and this is the biggest contractions and increases in this investment. So this is just done by an average investment count in the quarter for a 10-year preceding period and 2 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, basically from the second quarter of 2022. And you can basically have these beneficiary economies on the right-hand side. And most of them would be, I think, non-aligned economies by any measure. But then there are some economies that some people would say are actually reasonably aligned with the US, like Hungary or probably Spain on this list. Spain is also on this list as EU members, NATO members, etc. So, you know, in the primary analysis here, we go with something that is a little bit more of a convention in EBRD for other analytical work that we do. We just take a bunch of economies that imposed trade and financial sanctions on Russia after the invasion as bloc US, and that would subsume here Hungary and Spain. And these are they're about 45 economies or so. We call them, you know, bloc West, but it would include Japan and Taiwan and Korea and, you know, Australia and New Zealand as well. And then the China bloc, we here use a very narrow definition, just from sort of empirically here. You would basically put that the Gopinath and others list that they concocted at the IMF, putting Russia and Iran and, you know, North Korea and Nicaragua and a few misfits, but also very importantly for our purposes, Hong Kong and Macau, just to be sure that China FDI that gets routed that way and gets picked up here as China FDI. It's not really so much a statement on where Hong Kong is at the moment geopolitically as a convenience for this type of analysis. And so that's how we do it. You get virtually the same results if you just take the historical voting at the UN, as people do, and draw quartiles closest to US and to China. So that may actually subsume countries like Vietnam. If you look at this data and historical voting, you know, there are quirks in it. So if you look at the median economy, actually, which is exactly in between China and US on this voting measure, it happens to be Armenia. And that's probably not what people immediately sort of expect. As a member of Eurasian Economic Union with Russia, etc., people would push it much more strongly into Bloc East, probably in their mind, but that's not what's happening in the data. So that method is also not foolproof, in part also because a lot has happened in between historical voting and the most recent voting. If you take another step and yet go to the most recent voting, you will find interesting votes by US at UN General Assembly. So that that method that is most popular in the literature is also open to interpretation. Yeah.
I'm looking only at previous and GIS, but what about M&As? That type of thing?
So the data are a bit messier, but there is a paper by, so one of the blocks of analysis that I will come to in a second here is basically trying to answer a question, why in response to this geopolitical tension, etc., why wouldn't China just directly invest in the US? And there are many reasons why they, or the other way around, US to China. And that's what happened historically in the previous kind of Nixon type tensions. If you impose high tariffs on Japan, Japan would come and set up the Honda factories in the US or, you know, in Swindon, UK, etc. And that's how previous kind of rounds unfolded. And this is not empirically what we find now. I think there are many reasons for that, but one of the reasons that seems to be powerful in the data is that countries increasingly set up investment screening agencies to kind of discourage this type of investment. And a lot of it is really not so much in the actual screening, but in the discouraging value of that screening. And the latest debate was actually in Mexico around, you know, beefing up that agency to kind of signal to China that not every China-Mexico investment for serving the US market is welcome. So if you go back to this kind of work that I will show, then there are other papers that try to do similar things to show that investment screening has that discouraging value for investment. And so they work with August M&A data on mergers and acquisitions. The results there by Carsten Mauer and colleagues, and also Vera, I don't remember the name, in Kiel Institute, you have similar findings. The data much less comprehensive in terms of global coverage. So this database actually has fairly decent coverage of Bangladeshis in the world, and it's interesting to pick them up here. There you have actually very little for even Hungary. So EU15 is fairly well covered in August, but you want to have a good look at Hungary as opposed to Spain on this list with M&A data, and it's not really there. So if you have ideas where to source good M&A data for kind of this more peripheral economies in OECD, say, we would be very grateful, because that's actually the kind of research that we would really like to pursue. But I haven't been able to trace that.
Sorry, can you clarify to me what's a connector economy?
Yeah, so here we'll come back to it. So these are basically the empirical lists of economies that say FDI from China, and this is where it went. Actually, a lot of this, if you just look at the main increases in China economies, a lot of these are here in ASEAN, and this has always been the case, China's attraction for the region. But if you look at sort of China versus the rest of the world in investment for something like Thailand or even Malaysia, the difference between 2023-24 and in part 22 in some cases, Cambodia and the previous trend is actually fairly striking. In some cases, it's just from a very low base like Saudi Arabia, but also there are some kind of countries like Uzbekistan that may be there to serve Central Asian Russia market. And if we look at US, what happened to US, you will also find that investment to China is drying up very, very fast. Investment to India is picking up very, very fast. And that's kind of the caricature of moving Apple production, but it's actually happening in the data. If you look at where US has been investing most, you actually find some of the same characters, Malaysia and Philippines included here. So we're probably, so some countries actually managed to do it not only as a kind of the China market access, but also in reverse. In fact, the overlap between this list is quite strong, including in places like UAE, Egypt, etc. So that was one of the motivational parts. This is the US investments over time. The pickup in India actually did happen in sort of starting from 2022 immediately. In other places more than 2023-24. People also ask, so I think Cyprus is one of these quirks of FDI rerouting, that this database doesn't clean out perfectly, but there are no other funny Cayman or Panama jurisdictions showing up here, Luxembourg's, but Cyprus is one that you still have kind of US investment in Cyprus you would need to dig into. So then, back to question of how we define blocks, and then we'll take your question. So the blocks here, when we just track what's happening to investment, so the default way that we work is what I mentioned before. We have 45 economies, mostly EU, G7 and a few Taiwans of the world that impose sanctions on Russia, trade and financial sanctions, and that's Bloc West. And then Bloc East is mainly China, Russia, Hong Kong, Macau, Iran, a few others, and then non-aligned basically connectors are the rest, and that introduces the largest band of connectors here. You could do it, and we do it just as a quarter voting and quarter voting closest to US and China, and it produces the same kind of conceptually in regressions on the charts, the same result, but it would probably miss an odd Vietnam and connectors that may be otherwise too close to China in geopolitical terms. And I think it's just more interesting to look at connectors with a broad group of connectors, but you could define them more narrowly. And so the question is, what the previous question, we don't have really very good framework for answering it at the moment, but it's a great question to think of, in particular as events unfold. I think next year, what determines the differences in countries' responses, which connector economies will respond more to US pressure to moderate China investment, which connector economies will respond less. I think it's very nice to be a connector economy in terms of receiving all this investment from China and the US at the same time. I think everyone who has the right capabilities of doing it, and I will come back to it, is interested in doing it. Now, if then you introduce a pressure by either side, a bit like, do you choose Taiwan or China in diplomatic relations? So at the moment, there has been really no, I think you have all these economies with a very strong overlap. So there has been really no pressure on connector economies to choose one or the other. In the region where we work, Serbia is the best example. For years, having about quarter FDI from US, EU, China and Russia, adding up to about 8–9% of GDP in FDI a year. They have done very good business out of it. If pressure is piled up on Serbia to choose sides, that will be an interesting paper to try to find maybe some economic as opposed to political fundamentals of those choices. There were a couple of questions.
And just was one clarification, because now you're mentioning them all in terms of, I think you did answer that, but I missed it in terms of number of projects. If I was to replace this by value, you would find some very similar patterns. Is it highly correlated, the two?
Yeah, the numbers and the values are highly correlated, in part because on this large data set, which has about 300,000 projects, they are also reasonably distributed. So the connector economies block, the US, etc., of course, is the biggest market for FDI. But these other blocks, however you draw them around China and connectors, they're large enough. So the law of large numbers generally works in regressions, etc. In terms of in general quirks of the data, if you try to look at this FDI data, the projects on average tend to be similar, but say China investment abroad, they tend to be more capital intensive and less labor intensive. It's kind of more about market access or pursuit of technology. They have, joint ventures with Volvo, etc. It kind of has not been historically very much about trying to outsource kind of cheap labor intensive production out of China to Ethiopia. That may change. China is whatever it is now, $12–13,000 per capita. In principle, you could move some of this manual production to Myanmar and see what happens. But historically, it was, if anything, a bit the opposite for China, much more capital-intensive projects, and that's about it. When we try to look at heterogeneity of projects, otherwise, it's a fairly uniform bunch. So let me come back to, so that was a good introduction of the data. And so this is how it looks over time. And if you just were to establish a basic stylized fact, there are a lot of zeros in this database, so either looking at Poisson maximum likelihood or at inverse hyperbolic transformation, you would find that in the recent couple of years, there has been about 40% less, 30–40% less of cross-bloc investment. The interesting thing is that you don't find much if you net out the connector investment, and that means that connector investment more or less behaved, so investment into these connector economies behaved more or less the same way as investment within blocks. And if you were to invert it and split it further, you actually would find a very large positive effect of investment from China to connector economies. That is basically, depending on how you do it, is similar or even larger than investment within bloc relative to cross-bloc investment. If you look at other connector investments, such as US to India, it will kind of also be something similar to within bloc investment. So that is actually to show that this fragmentation is happening more or less exactly as people discuss it, but the role connector economies play is nonetheless very high. You can do event studies, and you will find, standard errors are of course larger, but you will find strong pickup in this connector investment roughly from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's a reasonably clean pre-trend for these macro variables, but it's not a perfectly clean pre-trend. And in particular, if you zoom on 2018-19, the first saga of Trump-China trade war, you will find some upward slope there, not as steep and not as long as the last couple of years, but you will find some other episodes of that. Markets respond quite fast. And so the other, so the first, I think, stylized fact that we find among these countries and try to explore is that a lot of this investment, it chases market access. So in those countries, you're basically focused in investment into countries with free trade agreement with the US. So Mexico works well, but also the likes of Morocco, etc. At least until recently. You would also have Serbia, Turkey, etc. Very attractive for entering the EU market. There are a few places like Hungary where you're probably still welcome to, or Spain, to enter the EU market directly. But we can also show it with a little bit more micro evidence here. And the way it's amplified by industrial policy in the US. So what we're trying to track here is the effect of Inflation Reduction Act that was passed in August 2022. And so among other things, it basically introduces this local content premium for a variety of clean tech in terms of what is marked in this database. It will be 16 of those tags that are listed there. And the way the Biden administration act was written is that local content that qualifies under various free trade agreements that US has qualifies for these subsidies. So if you were to import batteries from Korea or from Morocco for your cars, you can get a local content premium in the US. And so what we are showing here is a strong differential increase in investment in economies, in investment in these sectors, but not other sectors, that go into US or countries with free trade agreement with the US and a track record of manufacturing capability. So you can go to Morocco, South Korea, etc. Going to Nicaragua or Oman is not really helpful, even if they have a free trade agreement with the US. It's probably very difficult to quickly establish a meaningful production base. And before and after the Industrial Inflation Reduction Act. So the first dotted line is the war on Ukraine. The second dotted line is the IRA. And so the gray line is investment in these sectors to the rest of the world as share of FDI, and nothing changes much to that line. But there is quite a bit of uptick in the red line. So this is the direct investment in the US, and that's what US administration is rightly pointing as the success of that. But there is a very similar uptick in the blue line, which is an investment in basically South Korea and Morocco of the world that would come from China and the rest, who are interested in exploiting these supply chains and these subsidies, but are not directly investing in the US. And this is just to show who has the free trade agreements and how we sort them out. We basically look at the history of manufacturing projects in those economies. And there is a fairly strong cutoff point somewhere around Chile. You can put Chile in either basket, but basically there are a few economies with the trade agreement with the US, Mexico, Morocco, Colombia, that have had some reasonable history of manufacturing FDI, including in those 16 eligible sectors.
If you just, the other slide, and the last graph that you were showing us, the uptick seems to have happened already, as if there was insider, like you could see that the uptake is really sharp already from the Q1 of 2020, basically, right? Whereas the data points you identify as being important for this trend that you observe seem to come much late, almost 2 years later, right? So I was just trying to understand how you think about.
So I think that the way we want to do it here, and I will come to the regression analysis, is basically a triple difference. So we want to look at the difference between investment in IRA eligible sectors and other sectors in economies that can benefit from IRA through free trade agreement and other economies, and before and after, and difference everything else through double interacted fixed effects, and I will come to that.
Okay.
Because we have this kind of battery of critical minerals and supply chains and electrical vehicles and green hydrogen and wind power and whatever this is actually eligible. These are kind of technologies that have appeared not so long ago. And I think there may be something about that these lines pick up at a particular point in time in this database may also have something to do with how FT database tags them. It's just possible that there were a few of those early and they haven't been as religious at tagging them. I think what you would see in the previous pickup that is kind of technologically related is that the gray, blue and red line will go very much together in parallel, and in the IRA sort of example, they would diverge, and the blue and red lines will go together, and the gray line, which is into the rest of the world not benefiting from US subsidy, will not do very much. But it's, of course, a relatively small sample. I will come back to regressions. It's kind of an illustration of a more general point, but whether this analysis will withstand 25 robustness checks, we'll see. Yeah.
I agree with that, but these are also announcements, right? So
Yeah.
there might be anticipatory impacts, or Trump will usually collect four or five announcements before announcing the policy. My other question on this: any insights on the uptick starts in 2020 Q1? Is that what?
So the 2022 Q1 is the other treatment line that we use a lot in this paper, which I think gave rise to geopolitical fragmentation of investment strongly, and that's the premise of Gopinath and others' paper, and that's linked to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and basically taking sides around that, also coinciding with the energy crisis in Europe. So this is just to show that the right treatment line seems to be more powerful than the left treatment line here. But of course, here just to note, and that's also about announcements, that the Inflation Reduction Act was in the making for a year. It really started sort of being as a reasonable draft in September 21. And then around August 22, it got signed by Biden and passed by Senate. So the interesting thing, and it's also, I think, is relevant for the current debate, is that a lot of these announcements, they really wait for this to be signed. So although people have expectations of it going well through the US legislative machinery, until it happens, there is no evidence that people actually believe it. And, but once it actually happens and people have certainty that is there for a certain period of time, investment responds to it very strongly. So in the current trade war, it's a very good question what people have certainty about in terms of investors. Would be interesting to see how this responds. But I think at the moment, very few people believe anything. And the recent study, I think, also published in The Economist, trying to look if there has been any differential response in stock prices of firms that announce strong commitments to invest in US in response to Trump administration policies versus other firms. find either nil or negative effects for firms that commit to invest in US, which basically is kind of evidence that, the stock markets, of course, are not, investment decisions, but in general, I think analysts either don't believe anything or believe that things will get reversed more than upheld in the current trade-off. Yeah.
So in your previous slides, you made a finding that the U.S. investment to China bloc decreased after the war, right? Is that the finding that you made? My question is that prior to the war, was the level of the investment low to begin with, and when the war begins, it's just really low. It's like the countries that you show in the China blocks are like Mali and whatnot. I don't know if
So these particular metrics, you can do these various metrics, which we do if you look at US investment. But this is basically a change in the average quarterly investment announcements between the preceding period, average over 10 years, and the treated period. So the fact that you can go to minus 30 something for US and China will tell you that you start from a large number,
right.
like 50 odd or whatever it
This
is.
is China explaining most of the effect, right?
So this is a very strong effect, of course, but and I think this is true that this is mostly about US-China investment, and of course investment of almost everyone to Russia. So that's another thing that would drive those examples. The rest of US investment and non-investment is fairly idiosyncratic, but there has been a bit of a rift with Europe that you will find here on the left-hand side. My chief economist actually has been very uncomfortable with that and kind of presenting that and answering questions why US has been investing less in Germany, France, etc. But I think it's in fact of life, and a lot of these investments rely on reasonable energy pricing, etc. Europe is rather unattractive for a lot of these investments recently. The change in energy pricing, in particular industrial energy pricing, has been very abrupt in markets like Germany, etc. And in fact, the countries that fare a bit better here, like Spain's of the world, are actually quite good at relying more on solar and hydro energy, Spain, Portugal, and subsidizing it more as well. So I think there is part of that story within bloc. And so, but that would be, if anything, going against the results of the regression analysis and charts, because US, Germany investment, etc., falls into within bloc investment, and even relative to that.
So did you find like a positive effect or like a null effect for US bloc countries?
Well, this is just the raw data, and this is when you put it back into regression. So other connector investment for useful purposes, the bottom line is dominated by stuff like US to India investment, just because in this database, US is a very large investor. It's a fact of the world, and also giving ammunition to current trade wars indeed. So this is the triple difference analysis that I described, and you can find strong and positive investment on coefficient on this clean tech post-IRA connector economies with FTA and manufacturing capabilities investment. You can try to reinteract everything with China and have this battery of strong interacted fixed effects. And it's a smaller sample, and some statistical significance is weaker, but that coefficient that is of interest, sort of the major bulk of it is China's investment through these various channels with their US partners to benefit from US subsidies here. So the question is, relative to earlier episodes and relative to common sense, why do you need to seek market access so strongly through these various indirect channels? And that's what we empirically would find. Why wouldn't you do 1980s Japan to US thing by just going there and establish your shop. And I think actually to some extent that is happening. The red line is there. People go to US and establish their shop, but not everyone feels welcome, we think. And basically we have looked at investment screening mechanism proliferation using OECD data here. You have these investment screening applying to brownfield or greenfield investment. And that has been introduced differentially over time by these various economies, and we can play around. By the end of the period, basically 9 out of 10 economies would have special treatment for China investment. It would span a variety of sectors, although, you know, if there are sector-specific rules, they generally fall into some reasonable line. Defense production is most screened and tourism is least screened.
But I was just wondering, wouldn't there be like a more simple reason? For instance, me as a China, I'd rather go build a factory in Mexico because it's just much cheaper for me to produce and then import it into the US where I don't face any extra duties, rather than opening a factory in the United States where it's just much more expensive to set up things. Why do we need this investment screening mechanism to play a role?
So I think that there would be some of that, absolutely. And that's important. But in this kind of analysis, unless these considerations change massively, that should get picked up by country pair fixed effects and things like that. So we would have China-Mexico fixed effect, and we want to look at before and after the escalation of geopolitical tension. It's true that China has been becoming richer over time, and incentives for this kind of investment become stronger, but there should be nothing kind of really coinciding with geopolitical tensions that way. There is another, of course, element to it, which is harder to pick up. So now China would kind of softly discourage its companies to go and set up shop in the US in part of this trade war rhetorics. It's very difficult to tell how much of this discouragement is real and different from before, how much of it is PR, but of course can be self-moderation of this investment as well, will be one of the mechanisms.
Another naive question from the US's perspective, it would prefer that China came and invested directly into the United States.
Well, that is a very politically charged question. And I think that's indeed what has been changing a bit over time. So these are basically the percent of all investments subject to this screening measures to bloc US. And that has been going up, but particularly in recent times. And if you apply brownfield and greenfield screening and screening across sectors, sort of the most comprehensive measure, you would basically find that by now about 95% of all investment from connector economies and from China would be subject to some kind of screening and approval. So empirically, I think people like to have that, more and more would like to have that manual control over that investment. Now, the way it works is probably a lot at the level of discouragement. It works differently in different economies. The way it works in the UK, where we are based and where I had more chance to talk to lawyers, is it's very difficult to actually meaningfully tell the difference between brownfield and greenfield because you have to notify and you are on the side of caution. So greenfield investments may have some kind of brownfield component. You may buy some intellectual property with it, or an old kindergarten that you know comes with the facility or whatever, and that becomes part brownfield, and you do your notifications. Some assets may just fall into an area which is close to MOD, Ministry of Defense firing range, and you have to notify and so on. So then, if you notify, the authorities have 30 days to tell you whether they pull it for additional administrative processing or not. So UK has a nice regime in a way. So if you don't get notified, you can go ahead. Some countries like Italy, you know, are theoretically like that and practically not so much. You have about 10% of all notifications getting pulled for administrative processing. 90% go through. Of those 10%, so that can be a considerable delay. I think it's less time bound. But of those 10%, another 10% go for additional requests for documentation, parliamentary committee hearings, and the like. So in the law firm's experience, investors typically give up at that stage and just put the project on hold. So it never gets rejected or approved, really. But that's only 1% of the total, right? That gets kind of pulled. And I think there were sort of in Italy, there were like 3 outright rejections in the first couple of years. So the kind of government say no, or the TikTok kind of saga that gets, or you know, steal investments is relatively rare. But the discouraging value can be there because you kind of know where it's leading by backward induction, or you can be pulled into this heavy administrative processing, and you can decide. Then also, if you try to explore things like Industrial Inflation Reduction Act, time is of essence. Or with electric vehicles, you want to set it fast. If you go into 2-year approval cycle, it's a very different framework. And so I'll come back to it. But basically, what we can show is that somehow introduction of this screening, either brownfield or greenfield, does have this discouraging effect on bilateral investment flows. This effect is large. It's around 30%. If you estimate it by OLS, it's smaller, but also significant and meaningful. The main difference is in treatment of zeros. And you have a comprehensive fixed effects here: source time, source destination, etc. So source destination will difference out things like China to Mexico over time, and source time would difference out the changes in China as a source economy over time, its GDP per capita, capacity to invest, etc. So we try to the extent possible take into account exactly the valid points that you've picked up before. There is actually very little difference between those most screened sectors like defense and the least screened sectors like tourism. So the discouragement value of it somehow seems to hold. You can find a slight differential effect if you do it on a very detailed grid, trying to look specifically at sectors that had restrictions imposed and not imposed. But those effects are fairly not so strong. And it's also because of the way legalese works versus records in this database, it's very hard to know that those sectors that are marked here will be the sectors that lawyers would mark for their processing purposes. So that's more or less, I think, a little bit of micro foundation why this market access through roundabout routes may have been becoming more popular and more important relative to before. But the other corollary of that is that something that provides certainty and speed of investment access may be increasingly at a premium. And we play around a little bit with this investments into special economic zones here and show that investments in special economic zones behave differently from the overall stock of investment. Firstly, their popularity has gone up quite a bit. Secondly, they are clustered in certain jurisdictions that are very big on them. The Gulf, sort of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc. Now it's about 60% of all investment projects they receive, up from 30% a few years ago. Costa Rica is another one. It's kind of 35 from 10, and that's a big hub for US. But also a few other places, Egypt, with special economic zone around the canal, etc. It's still a small percentage of all projects, probably 4 or 5%, but it has been growing. And these are the examples of the special economic zones. And the other thing that we can find is that you have this kind of strong fragmentation for investment without free economic zones between bloc post-war interaction, but you don't find it for investment within free economic zones. Kind of nothing is happening, and the sample is small. Of course, so statistical significance is not quite the same in different columns, but the coefficient also falls 7 times, even if you look at the values. And if you look at investments, you just do them in different buckets with them and without special economic zones, and you interact with triple fixed effects to difference everything you can, possibly you have this very strong interaction term on the use of special economic zone investment for between block and connector investments post-war. So as an instrument, as opposed to US to Germany or Germany to US investment post-war. So there is some preliminary evidence that this geopolitical fragmentation has accelerated the rise of special economic zone investment as a tool, and then basically the Gulf, Egypt and Costa Ricas of the world, and Uzbekistan to some extent on that initial chart would be the beneficiaries of that. You can also try to interact it and basically you will find that investment screening has a deterrent effect outside free economic zones, but it doesn't seem to have a deterrent effect inside free economic zones. You know, that said, one sample is kind of 4% of this number or 3% of this number. The other sample is 97% of this number. So it's a little bit of a tentative evidence on this. So, and then you have basically the, you know, the traditional things that always go into investment regression models. The gravity, sort of geopolitical, cultural, and political proximity still works. It has always worked. But you can also show that it kind of differentially works. So, you know, one way to look at market access is to go directly where market access is best, Turkey and, you know, Morocco's and Mexico's and Serbia's of the world. But another way is to go to your neighbors that have always worked with you, you know, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia. They have slightly different comparative advantages. So you would expect that to happen, but it kind of differentially happened more in the last 2 years as well. And that's a little bit harder to put. These are basically this bunch of countries. Interestingly, not so much for Singapore really. That was very well reported in FT, etc. The number of projects are large, as they always have been, but you know, it's hard to find something differentially. So basically, just to sum up, it's a paper that at the moment puts together a bunch of slightly different and unruly stylized facts about which connector economies have benefited a lot from this episode of geopolitical fragmentation in terms of attracting FDI. But basically, you have more or less a menu of 4 things. And this menu is kind of, it's not that you need to have 4 or they're very additive. It's more like you have to be really good at one of those. It's really good to have manufacturing capabilities, because a lot of this standoff is still about actually making things and delivering them. Indirect market access is very valuable. It gets amplified both by investment screening that keeps the direct investment rule at bay, but also by industrial policy measures in large economies. You can basically benefit from that. The use of special economic zones appears to be on the rise, in particular to make things simpler, faster, more predictable, and bypass a little bit the kind of disapprovals and manual regulations. And geopolitical, cultural, and political proximity, the traditional gravity variables to major rival economies, they still matter. They work, at least for now. Now, it's a fast-changing world because it's a little bit of Lucas critiques. We observe that. Administrations in major rival economies observe exactly the same list. So the way it kind of is dynamically played from here will be interesting. But at least I think these are the stylized facts for the period from the invasion of Ukraine and thereabouts until the new US administration came in. So this is a 3-year period. I think the general validity for this 3-year period is strong because it's a global database and with reasonable robustness of these results. General validity for the next 3 years will be very interesting to find out. Thank you very much. It took longer, but then there were a lot of great questions to exchange views. So it's really the second presentation of this paper. So thoughts and ideas of how to develop it further are very welcome by email as well. Thank you very much. And any other questions and comments as well?
Thank you, Alex. Maybe we can go online first. I see a lot of people connected. If you have questions, please unmute and go ahead. Any more questions in the room?
Just again in clarification, because I'm still trying to wrap around. So I can see now why this investment screening acts as a deterrent to me as a person who's investing, because it imposes this high uncertainty, administrative burden. I was still trying to understand from the receiver's end, what are the main motivations that they don't want people to invest into their country?
So I think you have, so this is OECD PRISM database. So it's kind of harder for us to have good comparable data on connector economies as receiving economies, which would be interesting. But there are a few large economies in OECD here on the left side that receive meaningful investments. So they would be Mexico, Turkey, Colombia to a lesser extent. I think there are 6 or 7 of them. That's all we have in this sample. The rest will be within EU or US, etc. But there is quite a strong difference, both in trend that has been flat in these other OECD comparators and in levels. So I think that if you want to maximize exports and industrial capacity, so you're kind of Turkey and Mexico, you may welcome most things, and that's the left chart. If you are, where we are in the UK, there is a lot of sort of existential investment, whether this nuclear power plant with the Chinese participation was a good idea, not so good idea, whether it needs to be built with the French, and so on. I think there is a lot of that, the TikTok kind of, or US Steel, etc. discussions around foreign direct investment in these sectors, or the now in the UK, actually, the Chinese investor pulled out of the steel industry because they couldn't quite turn around the trade unions in the UK in the same way as they can deal with trade unions in China, etc. So it gave rise to also very interesting political discussions. So I think that some of those discussions on the right-hand side, the politics of this is kind of similar to the politics of tariffs in the first place. So the China-US trade tariffs, would they really bring a lot of manufacturing back into the US? Possibly, but not the jobs. I think technology has changed. You had 30–40% of manufacturing when globalization started. Now it's probably 15% of all world spending goes on manufacturing. I mean, when did you last buy a new phone or a laptop or a new suit relative to everything that you spend on, weekend travel or? So I think disentangling politics and economics is kind of difficult here. But yeah, it would be interesting to have a little more research into motivation and how this screening works. And I think that's exactly the earlier question. M&A data, the brownfield data, kind of the TikTok type of deals would be very interesting to mine through. So we hope to look for that data.
Thank you. This is very interesting and and respond to several questions we received from policymakers. So I wanted to disentangle a little bit your analysis. First, to clarify how you estimate the manufacturing capabilities. I think I missed that part. And then the question we received from policymakers is to what extent the preferential market access is a key driver of this redirection of FDI flows relative to other drivers such as, productivity, the business environment, and you mentioned some of them, especially economics, so number one. So I understand that for empirical purposes, you need to have these fixed effects. But can you tell us something about the relative importance of some of the drivers relative to others for those that you showed here, but also for others that you might have tested but didn't show, like other factors related to the business environment, the quality of the business environment, the quality of infrastructure and logistics, productivity, logistics, energy costs, to give a sense of the priorities the government can act upon in addition to the preferential market access.
It's a really great question. So the first one, it's a very empirical observation. So we just take manufacturing projects. We also filter them by actually manufacturing. So if you have like a manufacturing sector, but you have logistics in Singapore or marketing somewhere in Ireland, we net that out. And it's a fairly concentrated list. And in general, I think, if you look at world production and exports, if you make stuff, it's about 10 economies in the world that actually manufacture stuff, historically at very large volumes. It's very hard to break into that market. Turkey is probably one recent newcomer. Of all economies where we work, for 45 that we trace at BRD, we looked at industrial policy report. Turkey was the only one to gain market share in selling goods in the last 20 years. It's fairly concentrated, so it's a fairly empirical observation. You can draw this line differently. It will not really change the empirical results whether you include Peru or drop Chile from this list. On the capabilities, so it's a little bit outside this paper, but we have similar exercises in the industrial policy report. So it's very hard to know, but we think what happens and what we try to do here is basically you have to have some kind of, here it's a very empirical observation that these countries have a track record of manufacturing, but usually it comes from reasonable factor prices and reasonable infrastructure. You need to actually ship things out. So Morocco is great, and it has benefited a lot in the BRD region because you put it onto Atlantic port and ship it to US, very easy. If you try to do it from Uzbekistan, very difficult. So that you need to do. Some, on governance, people vary in their views, but, empirically governance and business environment matters, and then skills. So the problem with putting all these into regressions is kind of twofold. So what kind of database we have here? So here we look at where investors came and invested. I think it's very interesting that they came and invested a lot into special economic zones recently, but these are the special economic zones that investors think work. It's not random where this project appear, right? So in this exercise, we don't have a view, the opposite view. Let us look at all special economic zones that governments try to create to attract these investors and see what happened to them. So this is something that we do in the industrial policy report. We try to look at what happened to special economic zones on average. And there were in economies where we operate less than 100 in 1990, and now it's 1,300 or 1,200. Turkey is a big user of that, but others as well. So what do you find when you try to look at it? Well, you find, like with a lot of things in economics, that you can find a tiny average effect for an average special economic zone that is either there or not there, but for sure dissipates up to 20 kilometers. So government said that, this part will be great. So, if somebody says that Putrajaya and Cyberjaya will be great, you will probably find some effect. But whether you go to KL Airport or back to KL Central, you will kind of find no effect. So that much you establish for the typical special economic zone. Then, if you look at trying to see which ones worked and which one didn't, these are exactly the three variables that will produce some positive and meaningful coefficients. You will have mostly access to ports, basically to container infrastructure, to ship things out. Quality of local governance, which we can try to measure to get at the very local level. You would take a very endogenous variable. You would take something like world value surveys and measures of trust or things like that to actually try to look at different regions of Turkey. But you will find that greater trust as a kind of some proxy for governance will be associated with greater success and skills. So the very crude measures, again, on some tertiary education, etc., but they will pick up the difference between Istanbul and rural Anatolia reasonably. If you were to redo it with PISA results or something, you will probably get better results. So then we tried to look at the Turkey technical development zones, technological development zones specifically, and administrative data on all the firms in the vicinity. And there you actually find reasonable effects. You will find that after the creation of these technology development zones, you actually increase average productivity, employment by probably 0.6 to 1.2%, which is actually, they have a lot of these special economic zones. It's, on an economy scale, it's a reasonably large number, but it's also a small number. And then exports go up by maybe 4 or 5%, which is a reasonably differentially relative to other time periods and other economic zones. What we don't have really good data on is how much did it cost the Turkish government to create and subsidize those technology development zones. So it's actually a better example that it works. So to summarize, what we find is the average special economic zone doesn't really work. Conditional on the right fundamentals, it works better, but a lot of steel is unexplained, hard to pick up. But the good special economic zones, they really work well, compensating for that tail. But we don't know how much they cost. And so the cost-benefit analysis is something that competitiveness global practice experts have to do manually, I think. If you get actually good data from the government on how much they think costs, that would be great to do this kind of analysis.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Alex, again. I think we're about 10 minutes over. We should probably close, but there is coffee and snacks outside. So if you guys have further questions for Alex, you can stick around for a bit.
With pleasure.
Yeah.
And thanks very much for a great discussion. Always great.